Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is antlers, crowns of the animal kingdom, and it will be presented by our wildlife biologist, Aaron Bott. Aaron, thanks so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm excited to be talking about antlers today. For those of you who don't know, antlers are dropping right now at this time of year. We're just wrapping up the end of the antler casting season, and so I thought it would be a great time for us to talk about antlers, these very charismatic features of the deer family. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. By way of introduction, I'm a wildlife biologist and I live and work in the Intermountain American West, where I've had the opportunity to specialize working with primarily carnivores, particularly wolves, doing graduate studies, working with government agencies, and I've also had the opportunity to work with all other large wildlife that are native to the Intermountain West, including deer and elk and moose, which are all members of the deer family. So I would like to talk today about what antlers are and kind of walk us through their natural history cycle, the cycle of antler growing every year, what their purposes are, and ultimately what happens before the regeneration of antlers starts all over again in the spring. So antlers are a defining characteristic of cervids, and a cervid is just a fancy way of describing the deer family, the cervidae. So when we often talk about, or I talk to people about antlers and horns, I usually ask what are the known differences, and sometimes people don't really know. They confuse, for example, a moose's antlers by calling them horns. In fact, I just drove past a cafe out here in the rural West this morning called the Elk Horn Cafe, and I even, just for the sake of local colloquialisms, will often refer to antlers as horns, but there is a distinction between what an antler is versus a horn. So a horn is typically made of keratin, which is a protein that you find in your hair and also in your fingernails. It's also in skins, reptilian skins, and bird feathers, so it's pretty ubiquitous in the animal kingdom. But these hardened sheaths typically grow over a bony protrusion, and voila, you've got a horn, like the horn of a buffalo or the horn of a cow. And this is different when you compare it to an antler, which is actually a bone that is growing out of the head of a member of the deer family. And this is one of the defining characteristics of the deer family. So one of the ways that we look and identify deer and members of this family is to check and see if they actually have these really bizarre and unique characteristics, these bones growing out of their heads. Generally speaking, there are several dozen species of deer all across the planet. Most of my photos today are going to include members of the deer family found here in North America, since that's where I live. I'm most familiar with these species. In North America, most predominantly we have white-tailed deer, mule deer, we have caribou, we have moose, we have elk, and then we have several less common species found throughout North America as well. But antlers are generally a characteristic of just males in the deer family. And this is going to become important because we'll talk a little bit about their role as secondary sexual characteristics and what they're used for during the rut or the breeding period. So all male deer have antlers, with the exception of caribou or reindeer. They're the only deer species where antlers actually grow on both sexes. And there's some speculation as to why this is. Evolutionarily, these kind of plow-like antlers that grow on the caribou can act as tools for foraging out on the tundra, and it's therefore advantageous for both sexes to have these antlers. There's also signs that evolutionarily speaking, antlers perhaps may have been a secondary weapon characteristic on all deer in defense of other prey, or excuse me, of themselves from predators, or more likely through intraspecific or intrasexual conflicts during breeding seasons. And I'll talk more about this in just a minute. I'm kind of throwing around some terms that are very dense, a lot of jargon. So we'll break this all apart in a minute. But generally speaking, again, these bones grow on just the males, and they can be found in all several dozen deer species all across the world, with the exception of just two, one of them being the water deer species that lives in Asia. They actually do not grow antlers. They do retain this other secondary sexual characteristic for intrasexual competition during breeding, these long tusks, which is pretty unique. But if you look at antlers, you see them as large, almost savage-like spears growing out of the heads of these magnificent animals. And I think that it's fitting to declare them to be the crowns of the animal kingdom. They've truly inspired humans for millennia, and I think for good reason. They just look impressive. But when considering exactly the cost of what it takes to grow a pair of antlers, as a biologist, it becomes really fascinating to consider what exactly is it worth to spend so much energy and nutrition to grow these really cumbersome ornaments that are worn on your head that eventually you just drop, only to regrow them all over again. And so the cost of these antlers, the biological cost of growing these extravagant ornaments, has really fascinated a lot of evolutionary biologists and behavioral biologists for quite a long time. Again, these are just remarkable showpieces, and why have them? Contrary to popular belief, they're not really used as weapons frequently. If they were truly advantageous as weapons, then you would expect to find them on both sexes, both the males and the females. But now we have them found just in our modern deer species on just the males. And if they were also truly advantageous to protecting oneself from predators, you would expect to have them on deer all year round. It wouldn't make sense for them just to be grown in time for them to be thrown or to be cast or dropped, is what we call that. But growing antlers is very expensive. As I mentioned, they're bones, so they're an external bone that grows out of what's called a pedicle, which is a specialized platform on the top of the skull of deer, and they grow very quickly, very remarkably quickly. In fact, deer antler cells that grow are the fastest known growing cells in the animal kingdom, in the vertebrate kingdom. They grow faster even than cancer cells. And elk antlers, which can reach over 5 feet, such as this impressive bull's rack, they can grow over an inch a day during the height of the summer. But to grow these appendages, these ornamental bones coming out of your head, requires a lot of nutrients. So antlers are, just like the bones in your body, primarily composed of calcium and phosphorus, about 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus. And they are actually marrowless, so they're a cancellous bone. They don't have a hollow core on the inside. They're a solid bone compared to like our femurs that have a cavity for marrow, which reserves fat for our bodies to depend upon. And when animals are growing these incredible antlers, again, you're having to expend a lot of nutrients, a lot of foraging time, just to get enough calcium in your diet, enough minerals in your diet to grow these showy pieces. So again, these things are pretty remarkable. And here again in North America, these are some of the species that I have in my backyard, mostly mule deer, which is the bottom center picture, as well as moose. Moose in the upper right-hand corner have an Holarctic range, which means they can be found anywhere in the northern hemisphere. And they have the largest antlers of any of the deer, which makes sense because they are the largest members of the deer family. Antlers on moose, the largest subspecies of moose is found in Alaska, Alces gigas. Their antlers can weigh over 80 pounds, which is tremendous. And you compare that to the large bull elk that we have throughout the Rockies, and their antlers can weigh well over 40 pounds. So again, these really dense, very impressive crowning features on these animals that are frankly pretty annoying if you have to run through the woods with trees growing out of the top of your head and you're trying not to get tangled, etc. But it's been a fact, as I've already stated, that humans have been fascinated with animal antlers for a very long time. We've uncovered archaeological sites all over the world where antlers have been used by humans to ornament their houses, their clothing, all across North America, especially along the Missouri River. When Euro-Americans were first expanding their way westward, they encountered a lot of these what were called elk horn steeples, where indigenous peoples had piled up cast antlers for who knows how many generations, and they kind of acted as boundaries or landmarks along the river sheds. And again, people encountered these Euro-Americans encountered these as they worked their way westward. Again, this is just an example of people being fascinated kind of by these remarkable features of the deer family. And even today, we still appreciate antlers. They're prized by hunters as very characteristic trophies of the male deer family when people go out and hunt them. Antlers that are cast are often utilized by artisans to create interesting, very rugged kind of home decor features such as chandeliers or doorknobs. Jackson Hole is famous for having their large antler arches that extend over town square. And more popularly, and this is kind of wild to me, someone who appreciates antlers, they have become a dominant part of the pet industry, where they are bought up and sold as chew toys for dogs. Again, they're essentially just bones, and so dogs often like to chew on them. And just to put things into perspective, antler collecting business is really lucrative. I know that last year, an antler, a browned antler, so the longer an antler is left out in the sun, the more bleached it becomes. It starts to deteriorate because of UV, etc. UV and weathering. But a browned antler is typically about $13 to $15 a pound. So if you find an elk antler that weighs over 20 pounds, it will fetch on the market about $15 a pound. So 15 times 20, and if you're lucky, you can find the partner. So you got 40 pounds times $15. That's quite a lot of money that you can gather quickly. So shed hunting has become a really popular sport and a lucrative business. And again, a lot of this is, interestingly enough, being sold to the pet market. And for a very long time, for thousands of years, people have been fascinated in the potential and alluring medicinal properties or advantages that come from consuming antlers. This has been most widely practiced in Asia, where ground up antlers were sold as aphrodisiacs and still are sold as aphrodisiacs. And for a very long time, there's been an interest in eating antler velvet, and that's something that I'll talk about in just a minute. And it actually is sparking a lot of interest in the medical world for a couple of reasons. I'll talk about it in a few slides. But I think it's important for us to look at antlers from an evolutionary perspective. The big, impressive bull moose that we have today, the bull elks that we have today, the red deer, etc., they're really just a remnant of what once was a much more diverse and even exotic guild of deer on the landscape with even more incredible antlers. Most notably, we had the Irish elk, whose antlers reached almost 10 or 11 feet in width. And you can kind of see these incredible replications in museums of these antlers, or you might be lucky enough to to travel to some museums where they have actual specimens of these incredibly large historic deer. Meanwhile, we also have other subspecies or other varying species of moose and other bizarre deer that have since gone extinct. And this brings us to one theory about antlers and what they're used for, but potentially we're noticing what's called runaway selection. So runaway selection theory is antlers are basically a secondary sexual characteristic. So yes, they can be advantageous in foraging for food in some cases, like the caribou. They can also be a secondary characteristic weapon for defending oneself from predators or for competition for mates. But generally speaking, it's a showpiece. That's the purpose of these antlers. They're grown just like a peacock's feathers are grown, not for practicality, but for simple and basic sexual selection. And there are several theories that try and explain exactly how this came to be over millennia of these animals living and competing with one another for the opportunity to breed in order to have sexual dominance in their herds. But through sexual selection, there can sometimes be genetics that run away, that get out of control. And ultimately, these showy ornaments work to not benefit, but actually hinder the animals that are carrying these incredibly ornate crowns, as is commonly supposed with the Irish elk. So there's not a lot of advantages to having these huge ornamental antlers if you're going to be stuck in a forest while you're being chased by wolves, perhaps, or even by human hunters. And these incredibly large showpieces actually get in the way of ultimately your goal, which is to reproduce. If you can't live long enough to reproduce because your secondary sexual characteristics are just too showy, then it kind of defeats the purpose. So today we just have, again, several dozen species of deer, moose being the largest of them, that grow these still very impressive antlers. And we're going to walk through kind of the life cycle of these antlers, but it really begins in the spring when we have what's called antlerogenesis, which sort of speaks for itself as a name. Deer have these specialized osteoblasts, which are cells that grow again along this pedicle at the top of the cranium of these animals. And in the springtime, when everything is greening up and they're starting to get a lot of nutrients from the forage, from the grasses and the weeds and the browse that they're consuming, they're getting the minerals that they need in order to spark growth. But more than anything, it's typically the hormonal cycle that is driving the growth of these antlers. So during the spring, we start to see a rise in testosterone in these male deer species. And with the rise of testosterone comes the growth of these antlers. And when antlers are growing, they're covered at first in this very delicate and dainty velvet. Antlers, when they're first growing, they need a lot of nutrients to grow, but they also need a lot of blood circulating through the antlers in order to provide the antler with life for it to grow. So when antlers are first growing, they're highly innervated and they're highly vascularized. There's a lot of blood flowing in these antlers, and there's a lot of feeling in them too. They're soft and they're tender. They're not hardened, and they're sensitive. And interestingly enough, they can easily be deformed, and the deformation of an injured antler can actually result in a bizarre abnormality in its ultimate growth, and it can actually be retained in genetic memory for the following year. So if an antler on a bull elk, which is covered in velvet, gets injured, if it gets smacked by another elk, or if it gets cracked on a rock, that could stunt or hinder or mutate the antler in some bizarre way. Again, these antlers are very tender when they're first growing. And what's most interesting to the medical field right now is that antlers, and again, it's hard to not get ahead of yourself when you're talking about a life cycle of a species. But antlers are the only let me say it this way, deer are the only animals in the mammal family that have regeneration and wound healing capabilities. So if you think about a lizard, and a lizard's tail drops off, but it can regenerate that tail. In mammals, deer are the only group of animals that actually have the ability to regenerate and self reconstruct wounds that take place when an antler is damaged or when an antler is cast. And this has become very fascinating for scientists interested in stem cell research, because there's a lot of stem cells growing around the base of the antler that help self-correct when they're wounded. And again, they retain this genetic memory, this coding, which allows the antlers to regenerate the following year and be a more complete self if the hormonal levels of the individual animal are healthy and functioning normally. So this is really fascinated, again, scientists who are kind of at the cutting edge of this stem cell research. And because deer are the only animals in the mammal group that can do this, it's something that's captivated our imaginations for a very long time, and scientists are very quickly starting to make some incredible groundbreaking discoveries based off of this. But ultimately, as the year progresses, as they continue to consume enough resources to grow these antlers, the antler finally begins to harden. So the soft bone becomes hardened. There's a dying process of the skin where the velvet that surrounds the antler dies. The blood vessels are cut off. The nerve endings are cut off. And at this time, they begin to shed their velvet. And this typically happens in the northern hemisphere around September, where you see a lot of these big bull animals shedding their velvet. They'll be horning, is what it's called, by rubbing their antlers on trees in order to get all of that dead skin off. And in many cases, they'll actually reconsume that skin because of the nutrient content which it has. Again, the fact that these antlers can grow so quickly, over an inch a day during their prime, is pretty remarkable. And the mineral cost to grow these antlers is also very demanding. In fact, there isn't really a way that a mature bull moose or a bull elk can get enough calcium from its diet to meet its needs to grow antlers. There's been a lot of research in comparing and contrasting the sexes of these deer, and it actually has shown that some of these larger deer species, the males require more nutrients in their bodies to grow antlers than the females require in order to develop their fetuses inside them. So what often happens is the body of these animals starts to revert to self-digestion, and a lot of these big animals start to experience osteoporosis because they begin diverting calcium, in particular calcium intake, from their own bones in order to support the growth of their antlers. And that brings us to really the climax of this story, the rut, the breeding season, what all of this craziness is about. Again, these weapons aren't necessarily weapons. They're more showpieces. And the larger they are, the more robust they are, the more symmetrical they can be, the more impressive they can be for getting a mate in order for them to breed and pass on their genes. This kind of crazy cycle of genetic madness. But that's really what it is. During the rut, a lot of these animals will congregate from being bachelor herds, and they'll start to mix with female harems, with maternal herds, and then the males will compete as well. Ooh, I skipped it. I skipped this. I should say really quick, since I've got this in front of me, that this kind of supports the argument. This rut supports this theory called truth in advertising. This truth in advertising hypothesis, that one of the advantages to growing a robust pair of antlers is you're basically showing off exactly how fit you are as an individual. So in theory, an individual that can't grow a nice pair of antlers probably has some defects. They're not perhaps as healthy as a lot of the other deer that the females might be interested in. So having these incredible antlers it's an honest indicator basically of one's fitness. And again, this is what comes into play as we have coming to play intersexual selection. So we have intra-sexual competition where males are specifically competing with males and they will spar, but very often these sparring bouts they don't lead to anything too dangerous, because it's great to get a girlfriend, but girlfriends aren't necessarily worth dying over in most cases. That's kind of the theme of the animal kingdom during the breeding season. So be tough and be bad and go out and become a champion, but if you lose, remember you can always try again next year. It doesn't serve anyone if you go on all out and you fight to the death. Sometimes that does happen, but more often than not, it's generally just intra-sexual competition with the other males that are interested in breeding as well. And again, this leads into what's called intersexual selection, where ultimately the male that is the most robust, the most mature, the most impressive, he generally will attract the most mates. And this leads to what we find in most deer populations, which is reproductive skew. So the big bull gets a harem, and he has the opportunity to breed with all of them, and the loser males kind of just hang out on the periphery. And the big bull male remains paranoid all breeding season long, so October through November, and he even forgets to eat, and his body begins to waste away because he's so paranoid about making sure that he mates with the females and driving away any other competitors that his body kind of loses out. And ultimately you have harems that are primarily impregnated by one dominant male, and the other males just have to wait until the following year. And this kind of directs us to the handicap hypothesis. So again, just like the truth in advertising hypothesis, the handicap hypothesis shows us that the males that are truly the most robust, the most enduring, with the best genetics are ultimately going to survive the winter. They're going to survive the handicap of having been the top elk in this case, and having grown the most robust and impressive pair of antlers. Otherwise, if they're not fit enough, excuse me, if they're not fit enough, then their bodies deteriorate and they ultimately will die in the coming winter. And regardless of how tough you are, very often a lot of bulls do die. So as soon as the rut ends, the females break up, they split from the males, they go their own way after having bred with them. Now they've got babies coming for the following spring, and the males, which have been paranoid and have exhausted many of their resources directing energy and nutrition towards the growth of their antlers, they ultimately kind of go off on their own and hopefully survive the coming winter. Then quickly after the rut is over, we have osteoclasts, which cause cellular demineralization of the base of the antler. So the antlers typically begin to fall off first in North America with moose right around Christmas time, and the antlers start to shed. Then we typically have our deer species, or our white-tailed deer and our mule deer in January and February, and elk start dropping their antlers in March and into the first part of April. But essentially what happens is as the testosterone levels drop, the bone base demineralizes, the antlers then drop off. And it's kind of like a loose tooth. It pops out and usually there is some blood, but it's got to be quite a relief. And because it can be awkward to have one antler drop and then retain one antler and yet maintain balance, very quickly and very often the male animal will try and shake or rub off the other antler shortly after the first one has dropped. So it's not uncommon for people who go shed hunting looking for antlers to find full sets. Now, there's also something that's been recently studied in Yellowstone, which is kind of where I have a lot of my experience, where antlers that are retained can actually act not only as secondary sexual characteristics, but they can also be antler retention can work in favor of individual bull elk, in this case, as a secondary weapon characteristic. And recently there's been a study to look at elk and why do elk retain their antlers longer than any other North American deer species. Again, they shed their antlers typically at the end of March, right about right now, and moose shed theirs all the way pre-Christmas. So why do elk retain their antlers for so long? And a study has recently come out to show that elk that lose their antlers earlier in the season are targeted more frequently by wolves, which is the primary predator of elk in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which suggests that there might be some benefit for retaining your antlers longer if it helps you get through the winter when you are most vulnerable. And then in the spring, it all begins all over again. So after you've shed your antlers, after the craziness of the breeding season, after you've been left alone, if you can survive the winter, if you can survive the teeth of the wolves, you drop your antlers and then you start to grow them all over again in this wild and intricate example of secondary sexual characteristic selection. And I think that that's truly what makes antlers absolutely bizarre and absolutely remarkable. They are iconic as these incredible crowns of the animal kingdom. They are less of weapons as they are as showpieces. And not only do they attract their own sex, but they attract us as well. I think that they are incredible examples of evolution and sexual selection and putting pressure on species to adapt to different environments and to different circumstances in order to find the opportunity to breed. And at this time of year is, again, the elk are just starting to drop their antlers and the deer have all shed their antlers. I will wrap this up with lots of time for questions by saying that I think that deer and elk are a fascinating study of just how diversity can truly impact a specific group of animals on this landscape. And that is that.
Aaron, thank you. That was fascinating. I learned a lot. Didn't know how much I didn't know about antlers. We've got some great questions for you, so let's go ahead and dive in. This one says the term wapiti or wapiti, I don't know if you know if there's a right or wrong way to say that, is Native American for caribou or elk?
Yeah, so wapiti actually is a Shawnee word which means white rump. And so a lot of animals have very flashy rumps because flashy rumps, behinds, bums, posteriors, they can also be a secondary sexual characteristic, which is kind of like advertising. And yeah, elk are often confused when I talk to my European counterparts because in Europe, elk actually refers to what we call as moose. And moose is a Shawnee word, or an indigenous word. I believe it's also Shawnee, which refers to twig eaters. And that's what we call our moose here. So there's a little bit of a confusion. If you're going to travel overseas or if you're reading a book and you hear about Scandinavians hunting elk, realize that they're probably hunting moose, not the elk that you're thinking of. But yeah, that's brilliant. I'm happy that someone knew that.
When antlers are growing, is calcium from internal bones being extracted?
Yeah, in extreme cases, but yes, very often you are extracting your own calcium from your bones, which leads to osteoporosis. Again, what we do for love, isn't it remarkable that you will you will starve yourself in order to get, in this case, a beautiful cow elk that's interested in you.
If the males do develop osteoporosis, does it impact their lifespan? How long can they continue to live with this condition?
Yes, it does impact their lifespan, and generally they can rebound if they get the sufficient nutrients the following year. However, males have a shorter lifespan in general um, in the deer family. So typically, like elk, for example, they live so long. I mean, they can live over 20 years. Um, Generally, it's like a 15-year-old elk. Cow elk is a really old elk. Males typically live about 12 years or less. And I didn't talk about this, but I might as well spit this in now. So people often have heard the myth that you can tell how old a deer is based on the points or the tines on the antler, and that's incorrect. But you do typically have younger males produce less showy antlers because they're not yet mature and their testosterone levels are lower. When they reach their prime, that's when their antlers become the most impressive. So again, for like an elk, that would be typically between 4 and 7 years old. You're going to have incredible antlers. And as you get older, your testosterone levels drop, and so your antlers are perhaps not as showy or as impressive as when you were in your prime.
Hmm. Let's see. So let me just follow up with this. Like a loose tooth that wobbles. My daughter lost 2 teeth yesterday, so this is very, very fresh for me. We wobbled her tooth for quite a while before it came out. Do the antlers wobble or do they just knock right off?
They wobble, but I mean, imagine it being a 20-pound tooth that's on the top of your head, right? So typically they whack it against stuff, they try and rake it on rocks or on trees, or they snag it in shrubs in order to help them fall off. And in the best case scenario, just like some lucky kids, the tooth just falls out or the antler just plops off, without really any encouragement. So
Hmm. How long after shedding the antlers does it take for them to start growing them again?
well, growth generally starts as soon as the foraging opens up. So it depends on the species, right? Because moose shed theirs first here in North America. So they shed them in December, and they typically don't start growing them until March, April. But for elk that shed theirs in March and April, the growing process begins almost immediately.
Hmm. So does each individual animal grow the same? I'm assuming they meant like shape of antler each year, or are they different each year? Like, do they have the same pattern or shape, or
Yeah,
does
good
that
question.
vary?
Good question. So it does vary, which allows like wildlife enthusiasts, whether they're hunters or photographers, get really excited because you can typically identify certain male deer by defining characteristics of their antlers. They call the points tines. So some of the tines might have abnormalities. They might be longer. They might have been damaged, which leads to abnormalities. They just might have different genetics. I think one of the pictures of the bull elk that I showed had 7 points, which is like 7 tines, which is remarkable. Most elk just have 6 points. If it's less than 6, it's called a raghorn, which generally just reflects its juvenile state. But also animals that become castrated, because everything is driven with antler growth through testosterone. Animals that become castrated through, terrible, unfortunate accidents, running through the brush or getting jabbed by another antlered animal or something, whatever happens, then whatever stage of process of growth that they're in at that time immediately ceases. They cast their antlers, and then they grow very bizarre abnormal antlers, which they usually then retain for life. They don't cast them anymore, and that's rare, right? Most animals aren't running through the brush getting castrated by sticks and stuff like that, but occasionally that happens, and that castration can explain the abnormal antler features morphology.
Hmm. Since nature never wastes anything, what are shed antlers good for in nature? Do they feed any kind of animal or feed the earth?
Well, they're straight calcium and phosphorus, just like bones going back into the earth. And there's a lot of animals that depend on calcium and phosphorus for their own diets, for their own skeletal integrity. And so it's common to find wild, there's a reason why domestic dogs chew on antlers, right? And wild dogs, such as wolves and foxes and coyotes, they do the same things. Rodents will chew on them, raccoons will chew on them. And it's, again, you're basically gnawing on a giant mineral stick. But more often than not, they don't consume them entirely. And more often than not, they just decompose after many, many, many years, like a skeleton does. So I go out in the field a lot and I'll find antlers that have been cast maybe 10, 15, who knows how long ago, and they're just slowly being weathered away like old bones.
Hmm. What is a spike buck?
Yeah, a spike refers to typically a 2-year-old elk is generally what it's referring to, but it can be a deer as well. So it varies depending on each species, but typically when a male deer, whether it's a moose or an elk or a white-tailed deer, whatever, when a male deer is born, it grows just nubbins its first year. They're born in the spring, and that first year, they really don't have anything to show, just maybe buttons on top of the head. The second year, they'll grow what are called spikes, and it's very identifiable in elk. So they're like narwhal tusks that just grow right out of the head of the elk, just long spikes, no other branches. And that's a 2-year-old. And then typically when you're 3 years old, maybe even 4 years old for elk, they generally, or deer or moose, they're generally called raghorns because their antlers are still in the juvenile phase, but they're getting closer to their prime.
Is velvet marketed as a supplement for humans?
Yes, yes, it is, quite extensively. So deer, I've given a talk on deer. Maybe I'll do another one soon because it's been a few years. But deer haven't been successfully domesticated, but we've sure given it a lot of efforts. We have domesticated caribou or reindeer. We've tried several times with moose, but we do farm deer. In North America, it's illegal for you to sell any of the meat you hunt. So if you're ever wondering when you go to a restaurant and you can order venison, or if you see deer jerky or elk jerky on the side of the road, that is farmed. It's not from wild harvested meat. And a lot of these farms also will harvest velvet. So it requires an operation where the velvet is on the antler. And this is a worldwide thing, and I'm not going to get into the details about whether it's good or bad. I don't know enough about it to talk about any benefits that I'm aware of, but there might be some. But typically they have an operation and they remove the antlers when they're growing, and then after the antler has been removed, it comes off naturally later on that year, and then it grows another pair every year. So it's kind of like, I don't know, like the goose that lays the golden egg. You can continually harvest velvet from antlers year after year.
Very interesting. Okay, how long does it take for antlers to decompose?
I like bones. It really depends on the climate, right? If it's a wet landscape or an arid landscape. But like I said, I found deadheads is what we call them. So mature deer or elk or moose that died with their antlers still on their heads they've got to be at least a decade old, probably older. Yeah.
Is it permitted to remove antlers from national parks?
Not from national parks, no. You cannot take anything from the national parks. That's a good question because shed hunting, that's what you call this hobby of looking for antlers in the spring. And I love doing it, I confess. I think it's really fun to go out with my kids and my dog in the springtime and look for antlers. It's kind of like treasure hunting. But it's becoming really popular. And fortunately, a lot of states state wildlife agencies have restrictions on how soon you can go out, because you don't want to put pressure on the animals after they've just come out of a hard winter. So a lot of Western states don't permit it until after May 1st, but you can look up your own state regulations and find out what is permissible and what is not permissible.
Is a caribou exactly the same thing as a reindeer, or are they different?
Yeah, they're basically the same thing. They're the same genus and the same species. Some argue that they are a different subspecies, which it depends on if you're a lumper or a splitter. I might say that they're a different subspecies, but essentially it's the same animal. Caribou is the indigenous word for the animal here in North America. And yeah, like I said earlier, females actually grow antlers, and their antler cycle is different. It's still driven hormonally, but it's driven more by the birth cycle, their calving cycle for their offspring versus the males. So the males keep them for their rut, the females drop them around the time that they're giving birth.
And can you kind of review again for our viewers the relationship between the size of the rack and number of points and the age of the animal? How
Yeah.
is there a direct relationship, or is it really vary a lot?
It varies a lot. So a prime elk is 6 points, right? It doesn't matter how old it is, 6 points. If it has fewer points than 6, that means its testosterone levels are lower. It means it's probably young or it's very old. For a moose, I mean, moose have these big paddles, so no one's really counting the tines, but it's generally like 10 or 9 tines per paddle. Most deer are a 4 point. Most whitetail and mule deer are like a 4 point. So you have 4 or 5 points at most. Again, regardless of age, if you have less than that, you're typically you just have less testosterone. So you're a younger deer or you're an older deer. You can't count the points and know how old the deer is. It's kind of like the myth about counting rattles on a rattlesnake. It doesn't tell you how old the animal is.
So the relationship is not to the age, but to the testosterone level.
Yep. And I should say this too, like it's all about nutrition, right? If you got good hormones, which you need also good nutrition to have good hormones. If you got good nutrition and if you've got good genetics, then you're going to have a good set, and you're old enough, you're going to have a good set of antlers.
Fascinating. Well, Aaron, thank you again for yet another really interesting topic. I'll turn it back to you for closing comments.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I think the antlers are really bizarre, and I can only imagine what it would be like to come across an animal with antlers for the first time ever. But we kind of take them for granted because deer are generally a ubiquitous species across the planet. But again, I hope that this helped to enlighten your appreciation, help to facilitate your appreciation of these really cool secondary sexual characteristics, these morphological abnormalities that are so impressive and yet are all based off of the need to reproduce, the drive to attract a mate. So thanks very much.
I also want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.